In part 1, I covered making the fawn legs, horns, and ears, so watch that next if you're making your own Fearne cosplay. If you just want to live your best tavern wench life, this should get you started. Today we're sewing the corset, skirt, sleeves, and cape, and taking a stab at the moon sickle and staff of the adder. This lovely green taffeta I picked up at the Textile Museum sale a few years back. Faux silk, polyester. It's a lovely silvery green. I love that it kind of changes colors. And it's got this lovely brown inside, so really a great look for a druid. Very naturey, very ethereal. And then I have a couple like cape options, but I think I'm probably going to want something softer and something pink. So many leaves from various other cosplays. These are from my Rapunzel wig and the roses I needed for Lisa. Everything but the cape and the short white fur came from my stash, so I had very limited amounts of especially the green fabric. So some shapes that I would normally cut on an arc, like these and the hip swags, were cut on rectangles, which changes the shape a little bit, but I would not have had nearly enough fabric to make everything otherwise. I'm going to try and use this pattern from Josh Hart. It's got a corset top and it's got the kind of like gathered top portion. But if this doesn't end up cinching enough, isn't enough of a corset, then I'll probably go with one of these two that I make fairly often. We've got the Yaya Han and we've got the General Simplicity. No, this one's still McCall's. Got McCall's kind of like general purpose corset. I feel like this one cinches a lot and is pretty good. This one was also pretty flattering, but I covered it all completely, so now I have no frame of reference as to what it's supposed to look like. And then the sleeves are just basically rectangles, but if that's a problem for you, you can probably just steal the sleeves from like one of these guys. They've got like a good bell sleeve going on, but again, it should mostly just be a rectangle around your arm and then some gathered rectangles within it. So yeah, this should be enough to at least get me started. Let's get to it. In the end, I decided to use the McCall's M7306 cupped corset pattern because I was familiar with the fit. For corsets, I tend to cut 3 layers, a structure layer from a stiff fabric like non-stretch fit twill, a fashion layer that will be your visible fabric, and a lining that should also be a strong non-stretch fabric. Pin, sew, or baste your fashion fabric pieces to your structure fabric, then sew the sides together. Fearne has decorative lacing on the front of her bodice, so I've opted to sew them into the seams rather than add lacing, because there's no visible grommets. When your lining is also assembled, join it to the shell. I'm choosing to sew the bottom and sides together, leaving the top open to turn. Off camera, I stitched in the ditch, sewing all 3 layers together at each of the seams. My boning channels will run against these, so I can cut my spiral steel boning to just shy of the seam's lengths, and add caps at the ends. I run a second stitch about 1 centimeter from the seams to create the boning channels. I hate ironing and I tend to just put the iron on the highest possible setting, and I work with a lot of synthetics, so that can be a problem. It's important to test iron if, like me, you're not very trained in the ways of iron. And just make sure that your materials are not going to melt, because I have had that happen with cheap lace before, and once you've already got something kind of made, it can be really upsetting to have it ruined. When you have the right temp, iron all of your seams for a crisp finish. Then you can tuck the bones in from the top. Inserting the cups is always challenging for me, so you're probably better off reading the directions. I'm joining them along the bottom with the seams on the inside, and will trim the excess down and cover it with bias tape. I also harvest the underwire from an old bra, a fact that will be in my undoing. I cut some strips from my fashion fabric and sew it to the top of the corset like bias tape. The final thing a corset needs is a way to lace up. I use 2 differently sized awls to create the holes, then fit a grommet in them, and crunch them with a hand-pressed grommet setter. Generally, I space them about a thumb's width apart. The lacing is a satin piping left over from Tiki. It's a little slippery, so if you need a strong hold, use a shoelace. As per usual, I ended up making my corset just a little too loose. For the sleeves, I start by measuring my bicep and how long down my arm the band should go. Then I cut rectangles 1 times the height and 2 times the width. I'm treating the lacing on these the same way as the corset, so I pin the ribbon's X's down, then fold my fabric over the ribbon's edges and stitch in place. Then fold over and self-line by sewing all of the edges except for a small opening at the top to turn right side out. For the drape, I measure my arm from the bottom of the band to the longest point and the shortest point. Normally for something like this, you'd cut a semicircle, but my fabric is super limited, so instead I'm cutting more boxes. With the fabric folded, I cut a slope, rounding the angle out near the center. I'm using the whole width of fabric, but generally 3 times the required width is a good rule of thumb for ruffles. The 2 short ends should meet, and I finish them with a flat packet seam to be tidy when they flip up. As well, the entire bottom hem is folded over twice and stitched down. Then we iron. Now the slow process of gathering the drapes down to the circumference of the bands. I place pins at the midpoint, then center between each pin over and over until there's about 5 millimeters between each pin. Then sew them in place. I tie the bows and add a few stitches in the center of each to keep them tied. Then I use a wood burning tool to heat seal the edges of the ribbons on the sleeves and additional for the horn bow, necklace, ribbon, and bracelet. For the skirt, I have to debate how much gather I can get versus how much length I need. This too is cut at an angle so the front can be shorter than the back. I serge the edges but later double fold the exposed ones, like with the sleeve drapes. To gather the skirt, I do a loose running stitch along the top, pulling the fabric in as I go. Take a waist measurement and use that to cut the waistband. I have a ruler I like to use the width of, it's about 2 inches, and this time I doubled it for the front and back layer. Now I can adjust the skirt gathers to match the width of the waistband. So I'm using my offcut, which I've hemmed the same way as the rest of the skirt. And I'm hoping I can just gather this to kind of create a swag. Before joining things, I test my hip swags. This is another rectangular shape that should have been a U or seashell, but this is exactly how much fabric I have left. I gather them at one end and join that side to the front nearly center, and the other a little more off-center on the other side. Both have their other ends free, so they can wrap around and tuck into the waistband when it's worn. Now I add the waistband to the top, over all of the gathers, and fold it over twice to sandwich all the exposed edges. I didn't factor in any overlap, so instead of closing the skirt with buttons and buttonholes, I use elastics to make little loop closures. The white portion of the bodice is another rectangle. Double layered, gathered at the center and sides. It's then joined to the corset at the same points. Here it's chiffon, but it didn't really hold its shape very well, so I ended up replacing it later. I considered sewing gathers in place along the center bust, but the stitches were very visible. Before changing my mind, I also hand-stitched the leaves on. I didn't like the bodice with the chiffon on top, it wasn't draping how I wanted, and I found this really soft cotton. Should be plenty big enough. I'll be replacing the previous one with this one. So I bought 3 meters of 60-inch chiffon. From selvage till selvage at the floor, it comes to just about my shoulders, so I could use it in this direction, but to avoid bulky hemming, I could just use the selvage on the sides if I go this way instead. And it's not bad this way. I get a lovely drape at the sleeves. I'm just tucking it into pockets now to get a feel for it. And it isn't bad at the back, but it doesn't really flow as much as the art. Or I can avoid hemming the top and bottom and put it around this way. To get full billow, I could go end to end in the pockets and center. This gets me a way more billowy cape but I will have like 3 whole yards of hem at the bottom that I'll have to cover in flowers. So I think I need a compromise between the two, which will probably put this at about 2 yards across. Going with about 90 inches in total. I believe it is this. Okay. So this is my loft cut. And this will be the expanse of the cape. This is going to take a lot of flowers. So this is the plan. Gentle gathers on either end, another gather in the center, which will then be tucked into the corset. Now I get to do the math on how many flowers I need to cover 90 inches of hem. All the outer edges are double folded and stitched down to finish. Part of why I picked this project is because I thought I had everything in stash, and I do have a pretty decent collection of fake flowers left over from Rapunzel wig attempts. Maybe 6 in a bundle, which seems like a lot, but then she needs some on her staff, she needs some in her hair, and ideally they would be the same ones. You wouldn't have like a different type of flower completely on each of these. So if I dedicate like 1 each for her hair and her staff, then I only have 4 for the cape. So I went out and I got about $20 worth of more flowers, and I'm really hoping this will be enough and enough variety. My next problem is whether I sew or glue the flowers down. Sewing always has felt more secure to me, but you'll probably see whatever I do on the backside since this is chiffon. So is it going to look better to have a bunch of stitching messes or weird glue spots? I initially trimmed the floral stems to about 1 inch and turned them in so they're not sharp when I was going to sew them on. Once I switched to hot glue, I cut the flower heads as flat as possible.
Before you get the cheese, you have to please. They're getting bored. You just shout up, please. They're so beautiful. I know. Super juicy, give me another shot. So this go round, we're upping the romance. We got sexy
And Tiny Sage. Ruby was heartbroken. She spent the rest of her days living in just one cabin with her best friend, Anne.
If you want to.
Oh, wow!
The year for children. Ladies, you'll know step. Pleased to meet you, Beef. Prentice. So, let's talk about your needs. I know what I need. Mozzarella sticks. I don't think they have that. Oh, look. I still have to get drunk to even walk into the DMV. Station near the merry-go-round.
Yeah, So I procrastinated for like 3 months, and I'm finally starting to work on it again because there is a physical real-life convention happening soon and I want to be able to wear this, so I want it done, and I don't feel safe walking around without a handler in the fawn shoes without a walking stick. So I've got some pretty solid piping, and it's about 5 feet tall, so I should be able to make my snake heads coming out the top of this. I only have this much thick foam to work with. I have this much warble left, so that will probably be used for joining possibly the snake heads, but I don't think there's a chance of having enough for the whole snake. Let's see what we can manage. How I prefer to do it if I had more warble in stock is to cover this little foam pipe, and it's pretty close in diameter to my pole. So if I wrapped it in Warbler, I could get the curve of the snake neck pretty easily and just sculpt a head on the end. But unfortunately, it's not going to hold a snake shape without the Warbler, and I definitely don't have enough of either material to do both heads, so sheet foam it is. So instead of the sheet foam, I tried wire, tin foil, and foam clay. And the important test. Will it stand? It won't stand like this, but I think it'll be okay with a shell happening. But most of the foam clay was too old. Dry foam clay doesn't have much flexibility and won't smooth out. So most of this guy is made of foam clay that I bought on clearance because it was already old and then left it for 2 years during the dark times. So you'll notice it's like really bumpy and gross, and I thought that would work okay for like a bark texture, so I wasn't too worried about it until I realized like how much foam is on there, because you can't, it gets like really bunchy. It doesn't get smooth like the better stuff, the newer stuff, and so it's on really thick. Like this is 2 containers worth, whereas these guys are only half a container. So this thing is super heavy, super off balance. I'm not sure how hard this will be when it dries. I don't think it'll get any lighter, but if it gets hard, maybe I have a chance of being able to use it. But it's late and I am so tired, so we'll see how it's going tomorrow. It's going to take a lot longer than just tomorrow to dry, but hopefully I'll have a feel for whether or not this is even usable. Ultimately, the surface didn't smooth out and the wire wasn't strong enough to support its shape, and I'd booked a photo shoot, so there was a deadline, and I just had to start over. The new plan was to freehand the head of the staff to the size of my remaining foam, cut it all out twice, shape some lengths of wire to the shape of the snakes, then glue the EVA foam sides together with wire in the middle for a little extra strength. If the wire was stronger, it would also let me change the shape of the staff a little, but this wire was far too thin. I used the offcuts to make additional layers in bigger areas to give it a little more dimension. The EVA foam is primed with white glue. At this point, I was deep in crunch and stopped recording, but it's 2 layers of brown acrylic, 1 layer of darker brown airbrush, a bit of gold acrylic dry brush, and a splattering of hot glue flowers. The staff of the adder is a hole and another like 3 to 5 layers of 5mm craft foam, and it's been painted with acrylics as well as airbrush for some depth, and then absolutely plastered in fake flowers. It's not my favorite choice, but after 3 attempts I am satisfied with this one. I modeled my own moonsicle because I didn't like the ones available at the time. My printer bed is small though, so it needed broken up a bit more than I'd like. I removed the lip and dremel the edges smooth. Finishing 3D prints is pretty standard. Sand, super glue together, sand finer, prime, sand again, paint, and seal. Probably more sanding throughout if you have the time and patience. While the staff was more trial and error than usual, I hope something here was useful. There's no one right way to make a cosplay, and that goes even harder for something like this. With only a few canon images, so much is up to interpretation. Since cons are happening again, I've been able to see lots of other ferns in person, and they're all so beautiful and unique. I can't wait to see more of us out there. As usual, if you liked the video, please consider liking, subscribing, comment, tell me who your favorite Critical Role character is. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks again. I don't know how to speak to people. Thanks for watching. Bye.